Hey, what's up, nerds? It is Paul at Radio Free Hammer Hall, where everything is made up and the points don't matter. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about points changes and, in general, like the points values for units and things like that in Age of Sigmar. This was actually inspired by a conversation that I had the other day with Tyler from Warhammer Weekly. So, shout out to Tyler. And we were just talking about like the Magakin and the current state of the army and points and things like that. And he had kind of mentioned a couple of units. Like, oh, these things seem like they're a little bit high, blah blah blah. And I got thinking about it. I'm like, I don't think changing those points on those particular things is really going to do much of anything. So it got me processing through that a little bit. So I thought I would do a little video on my thought process. Um, and then I recorded a video with all of that, with a nice PowerPoint presentation and all of that stuff. But the audio recorded poorly. So this is kind of a re record, doing it on my phone this time with the PowerPoint over there so that I can read from it, or not read from it, but kind of read it and get my bullet points as one usually does with a PowerPoint. Unless you're bad at PowerPoint and you just read everything directly from the slide, which is the incorrect way to PowerPoint. Um, these are summaries. They are not scripts. Vince. Anyway, um, all right. So there are some points changes that work, but I would really argue that most points changes that we get in Age of Sigmar don't really amount to much of anything. Um, there's really, I think, two main categories of points changes that are actually effective. And that is when we have an across the board points change in an army. So where you have, not necessarily every single unit in the army getting touched, but like enough of it that everything that you're going to put into a list is most likely going to have an adjustment. So like all of that taken together, that's going to free up some space in the list. Or on the other end, bringing all of those points up so that you're forced to cut something. Um, then the other one is when we have a targeted move on something that is really problematic because people are running multiple copies of that unit. So that's like when something gets like spammed out. Then if you make like a chunky change on that one unit, well, it's gonna make a particular list not work anymore. And if that list was the problematic thing, then it's going to take care of the problem, theoretically. If you can knock enough out of that list that it's actually going to make a meaningful change. And that really leads me to my next point about these changes and when they work and when they don't. Um, it has to be a big enough change that it's going to make a meaningful change to your list. If the net change to your list is like 50 points up or down, it's probably not going to actually do much of anything to a list. But if it's 300 points that are moving up or down in your list, like, okay, now you can either put in another substantial unit or a couple of substantial units, or you are going to have to take something meaningful out if the points changes are going up. Um, so one of the kind of problems that we have with this is that there seems to be like a self-imposed constraint that Games Workshop has with their points changes. It it seems like from what I have seen over the history of the Age of Sigmar points changes, it seems like 20% is like the maximum that they are willing to move points at one time, um, other than really like outlier sorts of circumstances. And typically, you're more looking at around like 10% or less in the individual points changes. Now, that does it's worth noting that we're getting points changes much more frequently now. So when they're moving at 10%, like maybe that 10% doesn't do as much this time, but the next time maybe they move it another 10% and maybe another 10%, and eventually you get to something that makes sense. um, but when they were doing these points changes once a year, you kind of had to do something more like 20% more frequently, so that it actually hit it. And now, if you move like 7%, um, now that, because you're doing it maybe up to every 3 months, uh, then it can make a difference over time if you do it multiple times. All right, I'm actually going to skip my first example that I had originally done in my other video because, I don't know, I just kind of rambled and it didn't make any sense, I don't think. Um, so let's first talk about a change that actually did work. And this was, both of my examples are Nurgle just because, it's me. When the Puscoil Blightlord spam list was a thing, people were generally running like 7 units of Puscoil Blightlords in various combinations. Some of it was like, maybe like 2 units of 4 and like 3 units of 2. Something like that. Total of 7 of them. And then like 2 Lords of Afflictions loaded up with whatever. And what they did was they moved the Puscoil Blightlord points from 220 to 250, so it was about a 14% increase, and also moved up the Lord of Afflictions from 210 to 230. And in total, like, that was a big enough points move that you had to cut a unit of Puscoil Blightlords out of the list, because you just weren't going to fit at all anymore. So that ended up, making a major dent in that list. And if you were going to run it, then it was going to perform nowhere near what it was before. And it caused a lot of people to just drop that list concept, which it was a good thing. Like, it was way performing in tournaments, and it made sense. And from like the perspective of like more casual players, I don't think it was like a backbreaking change, because unless you're running like all Puscoil Blightlords, a change like that's not going to probably make a huge difference to you. But then let's look at changes that didn't work, that don't make any sense, and that is the most recent battle scroll changes that we got in January for Maggotkin. Now, a bunch of them, admittedly, were 5-point changes here and there just to round things off to 10s instead of having the denominations of 5s, which is probably a good thing. But also, just as sort of a tangent on this, if you think about it, if everything is in denominations of 10s of points in Age of Sigmar, we're not actually playing a 2,000-point game, we're playing a 200-point game, and we're adding a 0 on the end of it to make us all feel good about it, and to, I don't know, make it just have continuity from the total points that we've been using for competitive play for decades playing Warhammer. Anyway, so we had points drops on Fecula Flyblown in the Wormspat, Poxbringer, Spoilpox Scrivener, the Glotkin, Great Unclean One, and Rodigus. If you take one of all of those in your list, the totality of those are 145 points of points drops. I would like to remind everyone that a unit of Plague Bearers is 150 points. Now, you still can't even take all of those in one list. Even after the points change, all of those together are 2,090 points, so you're still over your 2,000, and you haven't even looked at battle line units yet, so like this is like a way over list. But even that, like, making that assumption, you're not even gaining an extra unit of Plague Bearers, and if you get an extra unit of Plague Bearers, is that really going to do you any good? Like, is that making, is that bumping Maggotkin up significantly in, like, tournament performance? No. Is this doing anything for anybody? No. So this is really the thing that I really want to impress on people, is like, and really hopefully people at Games Workshop are actually watching this, and doing the math along with me and realizing that some of the points changes they've been doing are a little bit silly. Not saying that they're doing a bad job. I think they're just being conservative, which, can be okay. But, if we are going to make points changes in an army, just because like it might give us some sort of like parity between armies to make us feel better about like, oh, this one thing in this army is 200 points, and over in this other army have something that's similar that's like 230 points. Oh, so that other thing that should come down 30 points. Like okay, like how many of those are you running in a list, right? Like, and how much is that 30-point change going to matter? So if you're going to run 3 units of those in a list, it's going to drop you 90 points. Like, what are you getting for those 90 points? What is that doing for you? So really, like, the points changes in an army need to be like substantial to actually matter, and typically, like, they don't. Um, and that really annoys me. And um, a lot of the points changes that I think people are musing about or asking for in units, you know, a lot of times, it's just people complaining on the internet. Huh, that was a motorcycle going by outside. That was fun. Um, Completely made me lose my train of thought, but that's okay. Um, it, again, just circling back to uh, a maggotkin example, just because we can do that. That's something I'm familiar with. Like, yeah, like maybe putrid blight kings are overpriced for what they are. They're 250. Say we do the inverse of what we did with Pusquo Blight Lords, and we drop them down to 220. So 30 points off each. Um, but how many of those are you actually running in a list? Right? Like, if you're running 3 units of them, you're only going to free up 90 points. And there is uh, 0 in the Maggotkin book that is 90 points. Nothing. Cannot even get a unit of Nurglings. So, like, like you need to make a bunch of changes, and like, how many people are actually running 3 units of Blight Kings anyway? Um, at 220, you would have to be running like 8 units of them to get an extra one, and like you can't fit 8 in a 2,000 point list and still have a general. So, like, what are we talking about here? Um, yeah, I think there's just kind of problems with some of this stuff, and I think we all need to be a little bit more mindful of what points changes are actually going to mean. And usually, I think points changes are not so much what we actually need when there's underperformance or problems. At minimum, we're going to need some sort of like errata, or we're going to need just new war scrolls, because there's a lot of things that, like, no matter what the points are on it, like, it just doesn't really have a very effective role in the army. People aren't going to run it unless they just like it. Um, and really, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not going to, like, in a broader sense, like, it's not going to make people run it that weren't already running it anyway. So what's changing the points on it really doing for anyone? um, so really, I think the big point that I really want to harp on here is, um, unless points are like really, really way out of whack on a given unit or an army as a whole, individual points changes are really not going to do it for you. The things that you really need to, I think, focus on are better list building, getting creative, and really learning the army a bit better. And sometimes it might just be the context that you're playing in as well, or um, if it's more of an anecdotal thing that you're underperforming, that's like you personally are underperforming. Um, how, you know, how are you playing? Maybe you need to learn to play a little bit differently. Maybe it's the meta that you're playing in. Maybe it's the opponents that you're playing against. Even big picture, maybe it's the current battle pack that we have going on. Maybe the army itself is really fine, and it's just that given the battle plans that are currently being played in match play competitively, maybe it just underperforms, in that batch, or it's not benefiting from the current battle pack rules. All of those things are possible. So it's I think there's going to be some armies that are just going to go up or down, right? Like I think the other example that I had dropped from discussion in this video was Sons of Bahamut. It's just a high point value, low war scroll army, so I think it's easy to kind of see how like moving around stuff doesn't make much of a difference. Um, but that army is actually a great example because if you have a battle pack that like what we have right now, where we have and this one and the most recent one, Galatian Veterans, Galatian Champions, they don't have either of those things in the army anywhere, and they have no allies, so they can't bring them in either. So what are they going to do? They're screwed. There's going to be some battle packs where that army is just going to underperform because of how narrow that army is. And that's going to be the same on everything. To a certain extent, pretty much every army is going to have that issue. Um, and sometimes it's just more overt. Like Sons of Bahamut is just an army that beats you over the head with this. This has an obvious linear sort of thing where it's good or bad. Um, like you would have to make massive points changes to Sons of Bahamut to really move how much you put on the table, and then even then, like not having any Galatian champions anywhere in the army makes the whole battle pack just mean nothing to you. So it's going to make your battle tactics a lot harder. There's going to be battle plans where you there's bonus points that you just can't get. You know, um, and I think that's it's just a thing to be aware of and think about. Like, it you got to think about context and things like that. Sometimes it's just not going to work out. So, bottom line, I don't know. Stop worrying about points and get good. Stop worrying about points and just don't give a shit about winning or losing. Just have fun. If you're not having fun with your army, change up what you're doing or change armies. Um, you can't really control what Games Workshop does with points. You can control what you do. That's a good lesson in life in general, by the way. You can't control what other people do, but you can control what you do. So if you don't like something, it is easier to change your own behavior rather than trying to insist that somebody else changes theirs. Some important words that I will leave you with. I will talk to you all later.